I didn't hear from too many of you yesterday afternoon, so I would assume that progress on your papers is progressing, right? Uh, no news is good news. Yes. I hope, right? I'm going to choose to believe that no news is good news. And so, um, so once again, we won't have class this afternoon. That's really free time for you to be working on your paper, and also for you to meet with me if you have any specific questions. But yeah, I just assume that everybody is moving around nicely. Also, this afternoon is a great time, if you haven't already, to set up an appointment with the writing studio. I haven't looked this morning. I don't know if they have appointments this afternoon. Um, but even if you can't get in this afternoon, to get in, after you've submitted your first draft is still good too. So, I strongly encourage all of you to have at least one appointment with the writing studio. And for some of you, you very well might find a couple of appointments useful. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to go on tomorrow. So remember, tomorrow by noon, you're going to need to have the first draft of your paper finished. And also, I would like you to finish, yesterday I sent out the peer review worksheet. I would like all of you to fill out the top half of that peer review worksheet, right? Which is basically the part that the writer fills out, right? So you're gonna fill that out. And then I'm gonna give you in the morning the name of who your peer reviewer partner is gonna be. And then by noon tomorrow, you're going to send that paper to them. And then tomorrow afternoon is just reading time, right? So we will not have class. That is really time for you to spend reading your peer review partner's paper and then giving them feedback. And if for those of you who took a look at the feedback worksheet, I think I have actually some fairly specific things that I want you to do. And then, of course, one of the things that that the writers on the worksheet are going to say is what things that they would like you as a reviewer to pay the most attention to. Okay. So, so you will all read each other's papers tomorrow afternoon, give them feedback. And then what we will do on Thursday afternoon is that we will all meet individually. So we won't really have class, but we'll all come together. I'll break you into your peer groups, and then you can have a chance to meet and talk with your reviewer about any comments that they have given you. So is that all kind of clear what the logistics are here? All right. So remember, tomorrow you want to have not just that first review done, but you want to fill out the top of that peer review worksheet, all right? And then you're going to send that both to your reviewer, but you're also going to send it to me. What's my role in this whole thing going to be? I will also be reviewing your first draft, okay? And so the first draft of your paper is what I'm going to give you comments on. I'll probably give you those comments either Thursday or Friday, so you have the weekend to look over them. Okay, so probably on Friday, I would first want you to get comments from your peer review person, but then also get them from me on Friday, so that you have that to work on over the weekend as we move towards our final draft of the paper. Okay, so yeah, there's all the logistics of the paper. So are we sure that we don't have any questions? Anybody want to ask anything about this? Feels straightforward? Okay, so you can obviously reach out to me this afternoon, tomorrow morning, if there's any problems, you have any questions. But yeah, my role in this is just to try to facilitate you getting some good peer feedback. And then, as I said, I'll try to give you some feedback, not excessively detailed. And that's actually one of the things I want to stress here about this peer review process, right? As I say in the worksheet, when you read each other's paper, I'm not asking you to read line through line and correct every single grammatical problem or solve all of the paper's problems, right? That's not what the peer review process is about. That's really not what I'm going to do when I look at your paper, right? I'm going to really be looking at big themes, identifying consistent problems, but really asking the writer to solve those, right? And that you should be thinking about the same thing as a peer reviewer, right? The writer will give you some things that they're most interested in getting feedback. Those are the things you want to focus on, right? And so you want to focus on the big things. You want to focus on places where you really are confused. If you can give the author some general feedback about writing style or things that are not working for you as a reader, that's great. But it is not your job to identify, every little grammatical problem, or to, kind of read all the papers yourself and critique their analysis of the paper, right? That's not your role, right? Your role is to more kind of give higher level feedback. And so, I think hopefully that will inform our job as a peer reviewer. So, when we read these papers tomorrow afternoon, I don't think that you have to be thinking about, oh, well, this is going to be an 8-hour job, right? No, I think this is something that, you can read the paper carefully. I'll reemphasize this tomorrow, but I would really like all of us to read the papers twice. First time, just kind of reading through and, identifying kind of higher level problems. And then the second time, as you read through the paper, maybe some more smaller details and some other things that maybe connect to those big higher order concerns. So anyway, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but that's really kind of what I'm asking for the peer review process. So I think this should be a good process, right? And it's good to get good feedback, not just from your professors who of course I have one thing in mind when I'm reading your papers, but to get it from your fellow students who in many ways might be better positioned to give you feedback that actually helps your paper, right? Particularly in terms of flow and making sure that it's readable. So, okay, all right. Well, if there's no other comments about the paper, what are we going to do today? So as I said in my email yesterday, in the syllabus, I actually had two things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about natural resources and I wanted to talk about finance. But as I was kind of looking through everything, it really struck me that if we're not going to have class this afternoon, I really can't cover both of those topics. So we're going to focus here this morning on natural resources, growth, and geography. Okay. Oh, hold on. I'm not plugged in. Sorry. Thought I was plugged in, but I am not. Work. Here we go. Okay, natural resources, geography, and growth. So if we were talking about growth before you took this class, hold on one second. Sorry, I got some chitter chat in the background. So if we were talking about the determinants of economic growth before you took this class, my guess is that one of the things that would immediately have jumped to your mind is, well, natural resources, right? Natural resources are an important source of growth. In other words, the fact that being rich or poor is somehow predetermined. By the luck of having natural resources. Right? And so that is actually a consistent belief among many people, is that somehow, there is a large component of being rich and a large component of being poor that's just simply random luck. And one of those determinants of luck is just what kind of natural resources you have, right? Are you lucky enough to have your country sitting on a big reserve of oil? Are you lucky enough to have a big, diamond mine under your country? Are you lucky enough to have lots of coal? Or are you lucky enough to have certain geography, right? Like access to ports or temperate climates or things like that. So, I would say a lot of people, if you kind of pulled the person on the street, one of the most important things that people would identify in relation to what makes countries rich and poor is just having natural resources, right? That's almost certainly something that would jump to a lot of people's mind. So that's what we want to talk about this morning, right? What does the evidence suggest? Does having natural resources make you rich, right? Now, interestingly enough, if you look at just the simple data, there's not a lot of evidence for this. Okay. Share my screen. So this is just one piece of evidence here. This is looking at how rich you are on the vertical axis versus a measure of how much natural capital you have. Natural capital would be a measure of natural resources. And you can see, yes, there is some sort of relationship here, but it is not strong, right? In other words, there are a lot of countries that have a lot of natural resources that are relatively poor, and some countries that don't have a lot of natural resources that are relatively rich, right? Like, for instance, you might see Japan and South Korea up here as relatively rich countries with relatively little natural resources. And then you have countries like Congo or Venezuela that have a lot of natural capital and a lot of natural resources, but are actually relatively poor, right? So if you just look at the simple data, there's not a lot of evidence that having natural resources makes you rich. However, that hasn't stopped a lot of people writing about natural resources as if natural resources are the most important things, right? Yesterday, we talked about this book, The Population Bomb. About how population growth was unsustainable in the long run. And part of this was based on this Malthusian notion that you can't grow without more land. Right? You can't grow without more land. So as we talked about yesterday, land is that fixed factor of production. And so without more land, that creates diminishing margin returns to population. There's also a book that was very popular in the 70s called The Limits of Growth by Donella Meadows. And this book really kind of posed the idea that natural resources were a strict limit on the amount of growth that we could sustain in the long run. So Meadows' conclusion was that growth would be unsustainable once we got past a population of about 2 billion people. And in fact, if you just to pick a chart from her book, this is her forecast for the future of economic growth across the world. And so she has this dotted line here of what would happen to the amount of natural resources. Well, they would go down because we would deplete our natural resources. So what would happen to food per capita? It would kind of peak here in 1960 or so and fall dramatically. And as a result, the population would eventually begin to fall with a lag. right? And so this was her prediction. Of course, if we actually look at what's happened in the world, it looks nothing like this, right? Instead of falling, food per capita has actually quadrupled since 1900. So, these kind of doomsday scenarios have not played their way out. And so let's think about, why is this, right? Why is this? Why hasn't growth been such the impediment, or why haven't natural resources been such the impediment to growth that a lot of people thought they were? And can we actually quantify how big a constraint natural resources are on growth, right? That's actually an interesting question, right? How much is our growth limited by natural resources? So what your book does is they create a little model here, and basically the purpose of this model is to kind of serve as a baseline for us to just kind of get a ballpark figure about how costly natural resources are and the depletion of natural resources are to economic growth. And so this is the model that Jones puts forward in chapter 10. And so let's kind of walk through this model and see if we can understand some of the basic implications of this. So the main thing that's different here is we have a solo model once again, but now we have a slightly different production function. Where we have an additional factor of production. E. E we can think of as energy. So now when we want to produce output, we need capital, we need labor, but we also need energy, right? We also need energy. Where does energy come from? Well, let's let R0 be the initial stock of resources. So, for instance, let's think about the simplest way to think about this is let's say the initial stock of resources is oil. These are our oil reserves initially. And then what is R dot? It goes down by the amount of energy we use every period. Okay, so our resources decline at the rate of energy usage. So if we use more energy, our resources decline a little bit more. And then finally, the last assumption here, let's assume the rate of energy usage is exogenous. And the rate of energy usage is just this. What percent of our resources we use every period to make energy. Okay. So in other words here, what's the rate of resource depletion? It's just the negative of our rate of energy usage. Okay, does that make sense? So think about it this way. If SE is 0.1, then we are basically using 10% of our resources every year to create energy. This is an exponential relationship. We're using 10% of our existing resources, right? So you could think about it like this. Right? How much of R0 do we use every period? 10% of what we have. And how much energy do we create? This much. Or plugging this in, we create this much energy. So we're using a constant fraction of our resources every period to create energy. Okay, so just to be clear, what does this mean? What happens to the amount of resources we have over time? And what happens to the amount of energy? The amount of resources that we have over time gradually deplete. And what happens when resources deplete? Energy depletes. Right? So our stock of energy depletes and our stock of resources deplete. And what happens if over a long period of time? Eventually, E goes to 0. Right? It never gets there, but it goes to 0 in the long run because we're depleting our resources of energy. Okay, so does that kind of intuitively make sense what we have in this model? So this is a model in which we have a fixed amount of a resource that's depleting over time. Okay, a fixed amount of a resource that's depleting over time, which means we get less energy over time, which means we have a decline in an important factor of production. We have a decline in an important factor of production. So in this model, I'm not going to work through all the math of it. But if you solve for the balanced growth path of this model, what do you find? What's output growth? Oops, not a minus, a plus, not a minus, not a plus. What's output growth? Well, as before, output growth is a function of G, as we found in the basic Solow model. But now there's something else here. There's a growth drag. There's a growth drag from resource depletion. And what is the growth drag? It's this term here. That's the growth drag that comes from resource depletion. So from this, we can see that the more that we spend on energy, the more that this depletion is going to be a drag on growth. Same, the more that we have an increase in population, that's going to be a drag on growth. So in other words, resources become a bigger drag on growth the faster the population is growing, right? Because more people are going to need more energy per capita. And then finally, that gamma, right? In other words, how important energy is to creating output. And as that gets more important, then growth goes down. So in other words, the more energy we need in producing output, the more the growth goes down. Can you set SE equal to 0? You might say, well, if we want to keep this growth drag, why don't we just use less energy? What's the problem if you set SE equal to 0 here? Well, if SE is equal to 0, then E is equal to 0. And if E is equal to 0, looking up at our production function, what's output? 0. So it is not possible here to set your energy usage to 0, because if you do, everybody's going to starve. Okay, so you can't minimize this growth drag. Or, well, I shouldn't say you can't minimize it, but you certainly can't eliminate the growth drag by just not consuming energy. Not consuming energy is just not an option here. Now, how big is the growth drag? Let's pick some numbers. Let's assume that alpha is 0.3 and gamma is 0.1. So in other words, this is an important one. Energy is about 1/10 of production. Let's assume that our energy usage is 0.005. So in other words, 0.5% a year. Pretty low number. Let's assume that population growth is growing at 1% a year. Then we go up to this formula. And we plug in here. So we plug in for gamma, we plug in for alpha, SE, and N. How big is our growth drag? About -2% a year. About -2% a year. I'm sorry, -0.2% a year. Not -2%, -0.2% a year. Thus, if we've been growing at 1.8% a year in the US, we could have been growing at 2% a year without this growth drag. Is that a big amount? Coming how you're nodding your head, yes. Is that a big amount? It is, right? Because remember the power of compounding, right? The power of compounding. Small differences in growth rates lead to big differences in levels. And so a 0.2% increase in our growth rate is big, will lead to big differences in levels over time. So to put this, use the rule of 70. We take 70 and divide it by 0.2. That means that basically, wait, how did I do this? What do I want to do here? Over 350 years, we would be twice as rich. So given that we have really 250 years of this, we would be 71% richer. Right? So given that we haven't experienced this growth drag for 350 years, but we've experienced it for about 250 years, just a back of the envelope calculation. Okay, this is just rough, right? Very rough. But we would be about 71% richer today without a growth drag. Would you like to be 71% richer? Yes. Yes, of course we would like to be 71% richer. So yeah, this is big. This is big. This is a big factor that's reducing growth. Okay, do we buy this model? Do we think that this is an accurate estimate? No. Or let me put it this way. It's hard to say how accurate it is, but we do know that almost certainly this model is overstating. The cost to growth. Okay, we know that this model is overstating the cost to growth. It's hard to say exactly how much, but we know that it's overstating. And the reason is because this model is not matching some of the things that we observe about natural resources in the real world. This seems crazy, but it's true. The first problem with this model is that our stock of natural resources is not depleting. We assumed that natural resources are depleting over time, but they're not. RT is not falling. The world is not in danger of running out of natural resources, at least at this time, right? That seems somewhat counterintuitive, but it's true. Let me show you a picture from your book, and then I'll show you some other data on this. First off, here's just looking at the price of fossil fuels relative to wages in the United States. If fossil fuels were becoming more scarce, then we should see their price rise relative to wages. But in fact, we see a lot of volatility, right? Like you can see in the 70s, the price of fossil fuels went way up. But then in the 90s, they went way down. In the 2000s, they went way up. But basically, if we had more data up to 2020, we know the last decade has been a period of very low price of fossil fuels, right? So if fossil fuels are getting more scarce, the price should be going up. That's not what we're observing, right? That prices are, they're volatile, right? They're volatile, but they're not consistently going up. So, there's just not a lot of evidence that this is happening. Look at other commodities. This is the price of commodities relative to unskilled labor here. In commodities, this is an industrial commodity index. So this is looking at the price of metals, the price of fossil fuels, the price of coal, right? The price of a lot of different sort of commodities. And look how these have dramatically fallen here. And once again, if we had data to 2020, we'd see that the pace of decline is actually increased, right? Right, the commodities are actually becoming cheaper over time. If you look at the stock of reserves, right? This is the world's stock of crude oil production. We continue to increase production, but what's happening to the stock of reserves? If you actually look here, today we have about 4 times as much oil stock as we did in 1945. So we have 4 times the reserves of oil today as we did in 1945. So what in the world's happening here? Because we know that when you pull oil out of the ground and put it in your car, you are using oil, right? So surely oil has to be depleting. Well, yeah, that's true. In a physical sense, oil is depleting. But in an economic sense, oil is not depleting, okay? And the reason is because there's market forces at work here, right? There's market forces at work. One of them is new technology, which has allowed us to increase the amount of reserves much more than were possible 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right? So there's been any number of new technologies that have been developed here over the last 50 years. Some of these controversial, like fracking, but some of them, fairly straightforward, like, not that I know anything about these things, but sideways drilling, right? Which has essentially allowed, through technology, a lot greater access to oil reserves than was ever thought possible. The other thing that's driving this is that higher prices increase supply. So when you identify an oil reserve, how big is that reserve? Well, the size of that reserve is not just physical, it's also economic, in the sense that there's always oil left in these reserves that is not mined because it's not economically feasible to mine, right? It's just too expensive to get out of the ground. But what happens when the price of oil goes up? When the price goes up, that actually gives firms more incentive to get more oil out of the ground. And so, one of the things that's happened, for instance, over the last 30 or 40 years, is that a lot of oil reserves that were dried up, right, have actually gone back and remined, because now technology allows us to get at that oil, but also higher prices mean getting that more expensive oil makes it, it's more economically feasible to get that more of that oil, right? And so, that is a big reason why we haven't seen resources, at least in terms of oil, we haven't seen resources depleting in an economic sense, right? Not in an economic sense. The other thing that's going on here is that per capita energy usage is declining. So instead of using the same amount of energy per person, we are actually using less energy per person. right? And I don't really have a good figure on this. Your book has some figures since 2010, but it's a little bit dated. But there is some pretty good evidence here. I'd like to show you a graph with some pretty good evidence that per capita energy usage is declining, right? And you know, a lot of this is once again because of technology. But then I think also clearly, maybe not as slowly as we like, but people's preferences are changing in the sense that people are a lot more concerned about their energy usage now than they used to be. Right? This is something that we worry about, particularly when we're thinking about global warming and the cost of climate change. So one of the problems with this model is that unlike the predictions of this model or the assumptions of this model, the stock of natural resources is not depleting. And so as a result, almost surely the growth drag is not as big as this model predicts. But there's another, maybe even more fundamental problem with this model, and that has to do with the production function. This production function does not allow you to substitute capital for energy. So in that Cobb-Douglas production function that we just looked at, energy and capital must be used in fixed proportions. But that's not really how it works nowadays, right? I mean, you can reduce your energy usage by investing in more capital, right? I mean, classic example would be you can build a wind turbine or you can use a solar cell, right? And so this is the trade-off that many businesses and many households have to think about, right? I mean, to be quite honest with you, this is one of the things that I've been tinkering around with here the last couple of months is I've been interested in putting up a solar panel up on the roof of my house and then selling any excess energy back to Mid-American, and then, you know, of course, buying energy when I can't get enough solar energy from the sun directly on cloudy days in Iowa. So, you know, this is something that's eminently doable, even for, you know, people of relatively modest means, such as myself. Now, for me, I've been trying to work through the economics of this. And quite frankly, from an economic perspective, I haven't really made the commitment to making the investment in capital, right? If I do, it's probably more from a preference position, meaning I do it because I want to do it, not necessarily because it makes economic sense, right? At least not right now. But clearly, when it comes to solar panels, we're moving to a day when putting a solar panel on your roof is going to make solid economic sense for many, many people, right? Because the cost of the capital is going down, while the cost of energy right now is relatively flat. But we could certainly envision a day when energy prices could go up. And so people, you know, people, businesses, everybody has this possibility of potentially substituting energy and capital in a different proportion, right? You might have saw, was it this week? Maybe it was last week that General Motors announced that by the year 2035, they are no longer going to be making gas-powered cars. It's only going to be electric cars, right? So what are they betting? They're betting that by the year 2035, everybody is going to see the economics of substituting capital for energy, right? Not that you don't need energy for a electric car, you do, but you need significantly less energy for an electric car, but you need a bigger investment in capital, both in terms of what you pay for the car, but also the capital structure of allowing people to recharge their cars as they drive around the country, et cetera, right? So, a better production function. And in fact, in the literature that like kind of looks at natural resources and energy and environmental economics, they often use what's called a constant elasticity of substitution production function. Right? Constant elasticity of substitution. And just to kind of write this down, we don't have to go into all of the details of this. I have this written right. Yeah, sorry, I knew I didn't have this written right. Okay, that's what I meant to write. Okay. So rho is that kind of funny looking P, is essentially a parameter here. And what's in our production function? Either capital or energy. The key idea here is, what happens if you don't use energy? If energy is equal to 0, you can still increase Y by increasing K. Okay, so in other words, there's a possibility of you substituting energy for capital in this production function. And that's probably a better way of thinking about production. Or you can increase A to replace E. So really, there's options here for replacing energy usage. And clearly, this is one of the things that's going on in the United States, right? And across the world. We are seeing energy usage go down, but production still go up. How? The primary way is through technology, right? Innovations in technology that are making us much more energy efficient. And then also increases in K, right? So there's really kind of two substitutions here for energy. All right, there's nothing that economists hate more than energy subsidies. Because energy subsidies completely screw up the market incentives that could currently exist to use what natural resources we have much more efficiently, right? What do I mean by energy subsidies? Energy subsidies such as all these regulations that keep the price of the price of coal cheap, right? So all of these waiving of regulations, waiving of clean air regulations, keeping the price of coal cheap. If you keep the price of coal cheap, what does that encourage people to do? Use more energy and invest less in technology and capital, right? Likewise, one of the things that really kind of drives most economists who look at this insane is things like gas taxes, right? Absolutely. The US government should be taxing gas much, much more heavily than we are, right? Basically, the gas tax in the United States has not changed since 1970, okay? And so as a result, the price that you pay for the gas tax is much, much lower than all the other subsidies that the government gives the oil industry, right? So in other words, the government's creating very, very little incentive to move away from gasoline because we keep the price of gas much cheaper, particularly much cheaper than it is in other countries. So you might have, for those of you who are interested in this issue, you might have followed this a couple of weeks ago, where we have a new president, obviously, Joe Biden, and a new Department of the new Secretary of Transportation, which is Pete Buttigieg. And so Buttigieg is a smart guy, right? And so during his hearings, some congressmen said, Pete Buttigieg, what do you think about the gas tax? Should it remain where it is? And Buttigieg, being a politician, he said, well, thinking about the gas tax, that's something we should think about changing it. But, we should consider it in a whole range of other issues. As soon as he even said we should consider changing the gas tax, people freaked the hell out, right? And he basically had to come back the next day and say, oh, no, we'll never change the gas tax, right? The politics of this are insane, right? The politics of this, it's like one of those third rail of politics that you can't talk about changing the gas tax, even though from an economic perspective, it's crazy how low the gas tax is, right? We should absolutely be making sure that the price of gas reflects all the negative externalities that it changes, that it creates. So anyway, this is just one example of where, markets don't always work very well, in part because politicians don't create the proper incentives for markets to deal with these things, right? So by keeping the price of energy cheap, and the US government in many, many ways keeps the price of energy too cheap, that really disincentivizes market incentives to invest more in technology and more in capital, right? So, so that's kind of the, I think kind of the one way to think about resources. Now, there's another way to think about resources, the impact of resources on growth, and that is to think about them not in their kind of straight economic way, but to think about how resources might impact institutions. So in other words, how resources might impact growth, but through indirect ways. But let's take a break first, right? So we'll come back and we're going to talk about how resources might impact institutions, and then we'll talk a little bit about geography, right? And the role that geography plays in growth. All right, so we'll be back here at 10:05. Economics is calling. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of a resource curse, right? We've been talking about resources in the model that we just developed. We talked about resources as if having more resources should facilitate growth, and having less resources hurts growth. But of course, maybe it works in reverse. Is it possible that having resources is actually a curse? Meaning it's bad to have more resources as opposed to good. Why? Because it encourages bad institutions. It has a negative impact on institutions. For instance, it encourages expropriation, meaning when you have a lot of natural resources, what's a good way of getting rich? Just taking them from other people. It leads to civil conflict. Why? Because possession of these natural resources becomes something that different people fight over, different groups of people. It discourages innovation. Why should I spend money on research and development when I can just dig a hole in the ground and pull up wealth? It also creates something that's known as the Dutch disease, right? Which is kind of a weird, a weird name given to this phenomenon. But the Dutch disease is having natural resources lead to an appreciation of your currency. And it makes your export industries uncompetitive because the exchange rate gets too high. The cost of exports from your country become very expensive. Okay. So this is called the Dutch disease because this happened in the Netherlands in the 1940s and 50s. Basically, the Netherlands discovered a lot of oil off their coast. As they sold their oil, what did they have to do? They had to buy up, to buy oil from the Netherlands, people had to buy the Dutch currency, the guilder, I think it is, right? So as foreigners who wanted to buy Dutch oil bought more guilders, it pushed up the price of guilders, meaning that it made all sorts of Dutch export industries and exports much more expensive. And over time, it killed a number of industries. So you might think, well, finding oil is great, but for many industries, it really pushes them out of the market. And sometimes these are industries that could be, for instance, technology intensive or innovative industries, that they get pushed out of the market, and that hurts your economy in the long term. So listen, does this have to be the case? Does having natural resources have to lead to expropriation or civil conflict? No, it doesn't have to be that way. But we can, what we see is that, history shows us that natural resources can be nice or they can hurt. Right? You think about the example of Norway and Saudi Arabia, two of the most oil-laden countries in the world. When you think of oil, you think of Saudi Arabia, right? And you think about all of the incentives that has created in Saudi Arabia. It has discouraged democracy. It has increased the power of a small number of elites. It has discouraged innovation in Saudi Arabia. It has not led to civil conflict, but only because the elites are so powerful in Saudi Arabia that they have essentially run it as a police state, right? That does not have a lot of basic human rights, particularly if you're a woman or if you're not Saudi Arabian. You have very little rights if you go to Saudi Arabia, right? So it's created a lot of institutions that don't balance, that don't create a shackled Leviathan, as we talked about last week, right? The government is way too powerful in Saudi Arabia, and that discourages growth. In Norway, we have a much different set of circumstances, right? In part because Norway was a stable democracy when oil was discovered. And so what has Norway done with their oil reserves? Interestingly, Norway just saves a lot of it, right? They save it. Norway has the largest government, what do they call it? Public equity funds in the world, right? Where basically the country of Norway has this huge investment portfolio. Where does the money for this investment portfolio come from? From their oil reserves. And so Norway has chosen not to spend much of it, to save it for a rainy day, to make investments where investments are needed to be, right? In excellent education and innovation. And, here you might say, well, what causes good institutions? Did having natural resources cause good institutions? Or did having good institutions cause them to use natural resources productively? It might be more of the latter, right? That here you have a situation when you have natural resources in place, or I'm sorry, when you have good institutions in place, you're much more able to use natural resources effectively. Last week, we talked about the Congo and Botswana, right? And one of the big differences between Congo and Botswana was Congo has never had a set of stable institutions, right? Congo has always been a disaster. It's always been a state in which expropriation is the number one way of getting rich, as opposed to Botswana, which actually had stable institutions in place when they discovered diamonds there. And so, you know, maybe it should not be surprising to us that Congo is going to be much more vulnerable to the resource curse than a place like Botswana, because Botswana had some reasonable institutions in place Congo never has. So, you know, just maybe one measure of how poor your institutions are is just to look at these. This is not by country, but just by region of the world. The percentage of billionaires whose wealth is derived from natural resources. Right? And so you see here, this might actually be some sort of reasonable proxy for how good your institutions are. That you see, for instance, in Anglo countries, relatively few people have become billionaires through natural resources. But in Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, I mean, a huge percent of their rich people are rich because of natural resources. And what does this mean? This likely means corruption, right? And any of you are familiar at all with what's going on in Russia, you won't be surprised by this, right? That you know, huge fraction of the wealth that's created in Russia directly relates to the natural resources, which is an intensely corrupt industry in Russia. So yeah, you know, having natural resources is not enough to make you rich, right? It's not enough to make you rich. It can make you rich, or it can help make you rich, but it can also help make you poor if you don't have those right institutions in place. How about the impact of growth? The impact of growth on the environment. Okay, well, listen, this is something that we could easily spend a lot of time on, and I don't want to step on Max's toes because Max is going to talk about this some in his literature review. So you're going to hear more about this next week. So I'm not going to say very much about this. There's just a ton to say about this. But you know, let's pose the question here very briefly: does growth help or hurt the environment? And the answer is likely both, right? There's no doubt that the early stages of growth there's no doubt that the early stages of growth almost always are associated with environmental degradation and higher levels of wide ranges of pollution. Sometimes this is of catastrophic scale. So we have observed some big environmental catastrophes in human history. For instance, Easter Island. Most of you are probably familiar with Easter Island because of those big heads, right? The big stone heads on Easter Island. But among environmentalists, Easter Island is famous for its environmental collapse. So basically what happened was the indigenous people who lived on Easter Island cut down palm trees to build boats. And as they built more and more boats and cut down more and more trees, they eventually had huge problem with soil erosion, right? Because it's an island and it gets heavy rains. And so basically when the trees disappeared, these heavy rains washed all the soil into the ocean, and they had a collapse in food production. Then as resources became more scarce, there was a civil war, the population shrank by over 70% in Easter Island, right? And that's part of the reason why these stone heads are so unusual, is that they really harken back to a time when Easter Island was much more developed than it currently is, where it has a very small population. You know, another example of this is the Fertile Crescent. Right, we're all probably familiar with the Fertile Crescent from ancient history, right? This is kind of where the civilization, human civilization, began to spawn itself, right? And so this is places like Iraq, where it's funny to think about, not funny, haha funny, it's unusual to think about Iraq being kind of the center of civilization, but in early human history it was, right? In part because Iraq had some of the best soil and best farming conditions in the world. But what happened? The Sumerians who lived in Iraq used a lot of irrigation. And unfortunately, a lot of this irrigation was with water that had a high salt content. And over time, the excessive irrigation got too much salt in the soil, and their food yields fell dramatically by about 2/3. And this still lasts today, right? We don't think of the Fertile Crescent today, right? The kind of Middle East is a great place to produce food, in part because their soil is still salinized from a lot of the things that happened as far back as 2400 BC, right? So these are, you know, kind of a couple of extreme examples of the way that, you know, when you have growth, you see these really, you can see very big declines in the quality of your environment, right? However, on the other hand, I think it can be argued that the best way to protect the environment in the long run is to make everyone rich. Rich here, I don't literally mean rich, but rich enough, right? Because what happens is per capita GDP goes up. We tend to see more concern about the environment. And as there's more concern about the environment, what do we tend to see? We tend to see increases in the quality of environmental protections. How rich do you have to be? The evidence suggests basically something around $10,000 to $13,000 in per capita GDP is when people really begin to think more about the environment. And so this is an idea, I don't know if any of you have taken environmental economics, but you've almost certainly been introduced to the idea of the environmental Kuznets curve, right? And so the idea here is what happens to pollution, you know, measures of pollution relative to your per capita GDP. So what happens at low levels of per capita GDP? People are poor. all they care about is eating and feeding their family, right? And so in general, as the poor country begins to industrialize, they do it in the dirtiest, cheapest way possible. And so you begin to see big increases in the amount of pollution. But then what happens as they become middle class? They begin to care more about the environment. And they have more resources to spend on the environment. And as a result, pollution gets better over time. Okay, so you might not believe it, but across almost every measure of environmental cleanliness, right? Except carbon, right? Carbon is a big exception to this, and we'll come back and talk about carbon and global warming in a minute. But I shouldn't say most, by as far as I know, every single measure, the US environment is cleaner today significantly than it was in the 1970s, whether we're talking about air pollution, water pollution, right? We've seen in the US that automobile pollution has fallen by about 75% from its highs in the 1970s. So you guys all know that I take a class to China. We'll be going back in December, remember, for you juniors, please come. It's going to be, if we can get there, if COVID allows us to go there, it's going to be a awesome trip. But when I was in China in, let's see, what year would this have been? This would have been 2012. We were in Shanghai. And Shanghai, while we were there, was going through what they called the smog apocalypse, right? Which was some of the highest measures of smog and poor air quality ever measured in a major city. And so the quality of the air there was so bad that, for instance, in the academic buildings that we were in, if you went out in the hall, you couldn't even see to the end of the hall. Like even inside, the air quality was so bad that you could see it, let alone outside where you could barely see across the street, right? Amazing how bad the air quality was. And the thing is, though, that air quality in Shanghai was roughly what was measured in London in the 1850s, right? So this has happened historically. We're in early stages of development. Things like air pollution have risen dramatically, right? However, it's important to remember that today air quality in London is many, many times better than it was in 1850, right? In part because London has gotten much more richer and they've spent money trying to reduce it. And I'll have to say, it's quite amazing to me how much better the air is today in Shanghai than it was in 2012. In part because Shanghai and other major cities have put significant money and significant effort into improving air quality. Now, whether this is true about all other measures of environmental impact in China, I'm not so sure of, right? Because there's a lot of environmental pollution in China, whether you're talking about quality of water or quality of the soil, minerals in soil, things that are not as observable. I'm not so sure that there's been as big of increases in China. And in fact, I think there's some evidence to suggest that while China's made some big improvements in things like air pollution, it still lags significantly behind in other forms of pollution. But, this Kuznets curve, I think, is something that economists point to a lot. They say, really, if you're worried about the environment, what you really need to do is you need to get to higher stages of development, right? And then you can afford to spend money on clean air, clean water, healthy forests, natural resource protection, etc. Having said all this, let's not get too carried away. Because I think there are some significant caveats to this, right? You know what I mean by caveats, right? Significant exceptions. Some forms of pollution are not national in scope, but international. As a result, it creates a free riding problem. Where every country kind of sits around and waits for the other country to solve it. Because you can't solve it in isolation. Only in cooperation with other countries. And as we know, oftentimes cooperation with other countries is something that is rare. We have very few effective mechanisms to make sure that countries make promises on the environment and then keep them. So to some extent, this refers to things like air pollution, right? Believe it or not, in Los Angeles, 40% of the air pollution in Los Angeles actually comes from China, right? And so, once again, China doesn't care what the air quality is in Los Angeles. So many cities on the East Coast were slow to respond to this problem because a lot of the problem just blew across the ocean into the United States. And that is at a small level what's happening with carbon pollution and global warming, right? Because carbon pollution is a global problem, right? Carbon that's emitted in the US has global impacts. It doesn't just impact what's happening in the US. And so as a result, there's all sorts of coordination problems and free riding. And so we may not expect a Kuznets curve kind of solution for something like global warming, because once again, too many people free ride off what's going on. I think the other thing that's going on with global warming is, listen, I don't know how else to say this, but there's fake news, right? Not enough people care. Because of a purposeful disinformation campaign that many citizens are not well informed about the causes of global warming and its consequences. And as a result, politicians and governments haven't done enough, in part because they, for better or worse, our government policies largely reflect the will of the median person in the United States, right? So I would love to be convinced of this otherwise, but I'm not sure that the median person in the United States really cares that much about global warming yet. And so as long as that's the case, our government policy is going to be very, very slow to react to this. And so, I think this disinformation campaign has really screwed with our economics, right? Because, as we go back to thinking about this Kuznets curve, as I said, the crux of this argument is as countries get richer, people have more concern about the environment. But what happens if a country like the US gets richer, but we don't express more concern about the environment? If we don't express more concern about the environment, then we're not going to get this Kuznets curve outcome. So, so listen, there's so much more to be said about global warming. Max is going to say a lot more about it, so we're just going to kind of leave it at that. But this is increasingly, I think, a really important issue. And listen, this is an issue that there's many people take fairly extreme positions on. I shouldn't say extreme, but there's much different reasonable positions on this, right? I mean, I do think that a reasonable position on global warming is, well, if we can get the incentives right, technology will solve all our problems. But then there's also a reasonable case to be made that, listen, if you consider the economic impacts of growth, maybe we shouldn't have any growth, right? And now I'm really getting on what Max is going to talk about, so I'll shut up. But yeah, there's some really interesting economics here that to be considered. We're running out of time. I want to talk about this last issue here. This kind of related to natural resources, but not exactly. And this is the relation to geography and growth. I can't spell today. Does the ecology and geography of your country matter? And so I want to just kind of share some arguments from many economists as to why specifically the geography of a country matters. Okay. Some economists have said, yes, it matters because simply different locations make trade easier. Do you have access to water or oceans? That obviously makes trade easier. Do you know, fun fact, %50 of the world's population lives within 20 miles of the sea or the ocean. Fun fact, right? I mean, this has traditionally been where humans have lived because being on the water significantly reduces transportation costs, sorry. So despite, what is the number? Only 10% of the world's land being within 20 miles of the sea or ocean, 50% of the world's people live there. So while I'm telling fun facts, think about the difference between Africa and Europe. Okay, if I just ask you who has more coastline, Africa or Europe, well, the obvious answer is Africa, right? Look how much bigger Africa is. In fact, while Africa is 8 times the size of Europe, it has half the amount of coastline. I'll say that again. Africa is 8 times the size of Europe, but has half the amount of coastline. So, you look at Africa and it's got that really smooth coast, right? And not just smooth coast, but what those smooth coasts do is it means that they don't have very good deep water ports, right? As opposed to Europe, which has a very crinkly coast, right? And the crinkly coast creates not just more miles of coast, but also creates a lot more ports that are deep water that allows for deep or for heavy cargo shipping, right? And so as a result, transportation costs in Europe are much cheaper than they are in Africa, right? And the same goes for the United States, right? In the US, transportation costs in the US are about 4% of the price of goods. In Africa, they're about 20% of the price of goods, right? So you can't use ports. And then what happens if you try to travel across the interior of Africa? Well, we know there's few roads, there's lots of jungle, there's lots of mountains, right? There's very few rivers in Africa of any substantial size relative to the size of the country. And so, these are just kind of the oddities of of the natural world, right? That heavily favor Europe, but did not favor Africa. Okay, ecology itself, meaning kind of the natural environment. So if you're interested in this topic, we'll come back and talk about this book a little bit easier, or little bit later, but there's this book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel. As I said, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about pandemics, because this book is also about pandemics, as you can tell from the germs part of this. But Diamond makes the argument that, you know, when you think about when Columbus landed in the Americas, right? Why is it that Euro-Asian culture came to dominate in the Americas, right? When there was this first interaction. And Diamond said, well, Europe and Asia had a lot of ecological advantages over the Americas, right? They had a much more temperate climate that allowed for higher agricultural productivity that led to a higher population. In addition, they had more domesticatable animals. And domesticatable animals were important not only because they provided food and power, but also because they exposed Westerners to germs. And so while Westerners have been much more subject to pandemics over time, these pandemics made the Americans much more vulnerable when the two cultures met. And so, you know, that is one big part of the story about why European culture came to dominate in the Americas, is that so many indigenous people died within the first 50 years of them meeting, right? And a lot of that death, most of that death, was associated with the pandemics that the Europeans brought with them, right? Native plants in Europe are much easier to cultivate than the native plants in America. Why? Just natural luck, right? Of the 15 most cultivated plants, I believe only one of them originates from the Americas, corn, right? Every other cultivated plant originates from Europe or Asia, right? So these ecological advantages led Europe and Asia to move to agriculture much earlier than the Americas, allowed them to create new technologies, including weaponry, and expose them to germs that then gave them distinct advantages, right? That gave them distinct advantages. And so, you know, and I guess, you know, the resulting argument to this is that there is a path dependence to history. That while today horses are spread throughout the world and you can grow corn or soybeans everywhere, there's a path dependence to history, right? The early advantages have led to modern advantages for some of these countries. Many other authors have said, well, geography has impacts on institutions. Okay, so work with me on this one, because this one is a little harder to understand. But I think the best way to explain this and how geography could impact institutions is to think about the geography of Europe versus China. what does Europe's natural geography look like? Europe is what's known as a naturally fragmented area. And what do I mean by this? Europe has multiple mountain ranges, numerous rivers, seas, channels, rough coasts, islands. Okay, it's a fragmented area. Its natural geography is fragmented. So the idea is this led to localized power and competition among various states. There was more trade because you had all these little localized community. And competition between these states created better institutions. Right? You got the shackled Leviathan more, right? You had strong governments, but not too strong. Okay, how about China? The argument here is that China is really not naturally fragmented in the same way. There is a big, there's kind of two big areas of China, right? You have the flat coast, and you have the Tibetan Plateau. But in general, China, its geography, and once again, I'm not sure if I completely buy this. I have to tell you, I'm not really sure if I buy this, but this is the argument, that its geography really led to a lot more central power. And of course, that is one of the things that is completely unique about China, is not just that it is a relatively homogeneous place culturally, right? It's such a big area, has stayed remote, you know, it's a distinct civilization, right? China has been a relatively stable civilization for a very, very long time. Not only that, but it's largely been controlled by one single government. Now, who that government is has changed a lot over time, right? But always, most of Chinese history, it's been one group that's been in power. And part of that is the geography of China that is basically helped facilitate that. And so what's the problem with that? The government isn't too strong. That it's largely been throughout Chinese history an autocracy, where you have very few people controlling everything, and that creates poor institutions because it gives elites too much power. And it tends to lead to corruption, etc. So there's a saying in China, I don't know if any of our Chinese classmates are familiar with this saying, but I always like it. But supposedly there's an old saying in China that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, right? Kind of this idea that, yeah, there's central power, but yeah, you know, if you can kind of cheat your way around it, sure. And that kind of idea is to some extent, you know, a reflection of the geography of China. I honestly don't know if I buy this. I'm a little skeptical about it, but you know, this is the idea of many historians, economic historians, is that geography has played a role this way. One last thing here. I know we're running short on time. Another way that people have said the geography plays a role is just simply through climate. the tropics are hotter. And so the idea is that this creates many disadvantages. That reduce growth. For instance, it reduces worker effort because it's hotter. And when it's hotter, people work less, right? Also, it tends to increase disease, such as malaria, sleeping sickness, Dengue's fever, river blindness, hookworms. Why do hotter temperatures encourage disease? Because many of these are borne by insects. And so without a freeze, you're going to get more insects. Okay, so for instance, in temperate areas that tend to freeze in the winter, that tends to keep insect populations down. But in the tropics where you don't get the freeze, you tend to get a lot more disease, right, this way. So you think about, something like malaria, right, as the classic example of this. According to the World Health Organization, if you look in Latin America alone, in malaria-free regions of Latin America, they have 50% higher wages than in not malaria-free zones, right? So in malaria-free zones are richer. Why? Because when you have malaria, you have lost work days, missed schooling, higher healthcare costs, reduced productivity. These things create poverty, and it creates poverty traps, right? And so there is this kind of health, we're going to talk more about this a little bit later in the week, but there's a health part of poverty traps, right? That poor health creates more poverty, which then tends to create more poor health, right? And so, there's been a lot of some data that suggests that yes, right? That part of the reason why a lot of poverty is in the climates is just simply because it's hotter there, and hotter creates a lot of, disadvantages for growth. Having said all this, do most economists believe that ecology and natural resources determine how rich a country is? No, I don't think that most economists really do believe that. We are not saying that they have not played any role, but we're also saying that there's ways to overcome these disadvantages, and certain countries have, right? So not all countries in the tropics are poor. Also in the tropics are parts of southern China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, right? Relatively rich places. So, think about something like this last topic that we talked about, disease and malaria. Do you know that the US used to have a problem with malaria, right? So, yeah, we had a problem with malaria here in the Midwest, right? Usually Missouri and south of that, you'd have malaria zones, but we don't anymore. Why? Because we invested in technologies and invested in other things that have reduced malaria, such as cleaning up, stagnant water, better water transportation systems, better sewage systems. All of these things have reduced the insect disease and have then reduced malaria. So it's not the case that being in a malaria zone is impossible to get around. For instance, just to pick another example, today, Spain and India have the same malarial ecology, and yet Spain has no malaria, and India has 66% of its population at risk for malaria on a daily basis, right? That's not just about ecology. It's about not making the investments that you need to make to reduce the incidence of malaria. Same for, worker effort. Yeah, it is harder to work in hot places, but you know what we've done in the US is we've made air conditioning readily available, right? And so things like air conditioning, there are technological solutions to some of these problems. Some countries have been able to implement them because, you know, of better institutions, and then also possibly because they're richer, but other countries have not been able to do that. So, you know, I don't want to completely discount the role of, um, of geology and ecology, because I do think there's something here. I do think there's something here, particularly from a historical perspective. But I also think that we don't want to overstate how important it is, right? Because countries have been able to overcome any disadvantages that they have in geology or geography or ecology. But it takes making the right investments and, once again, getting back to having the right institutions. So, okay, I've gone a little bit too long. So does anybody have any questions about anything before I let you go? So remember, you should be working on getting that first draft. That first draft and your peer review worksheet has to be filled out by tomorrow at noon. So tomorrow at noon, we will work out the logistics of the peer review, okay? If any of you want to talk to me this afternoon, I'm basically between particularly like about 1 and 3:30, I'm available. So send me an email and we can have a short talk, or we can just exchange ideas through email, okay? All right, everybody. See you tomorrow.